Let's come back from the lunch break, please. Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Orth. I'm a hearing officer appointed by the Environmental Improvement Board to conduct a hearing in EIB 21-27 on ozone precursors. We are on day 8 of the hearing and have reached the 1 p.m. public comment session. I will call expressly on those of you who reached out to the board administrator and Pam Jones. If you are on the platform to offer public comment and did not reach out to the administrator, I'm still happy to take your comment. Reach out, please, in the chat. And if you have any trouble with the chat function, which is enabled for everyone, please reach out to Pam at 505-660-4305. I'll call on you in this order. Harold Pope, Rebecca Long, George Greenlee, Elizabeth Ortega, Lori Walters, Shelly Manlev, Patricia Stern, Jonathan Senna, and Jesse Barnes. 3 things about public comment. It is taken under oath, as with all testimony before the board. It's taken by audio, not video, and it's limited to 5 minutes. So let me find Senator Pope first. All right, I am not seeing Senator Pope. Let me go to Commissioner Long. Oh, Commissioner Long, I've unmuted you. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes, ma'am. I appreciate you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, your voice is coming through clearly. If you would please spell your name for the transcript.
It's REBECCA-LONG.
Thank you very much. And raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do, yes.
Thank you. I'm going to start your 5 minutes now.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity today. So I am the Lee County Commission Chair, and my name is Rebecca Long. I just want to give a few comments on what the oil and gas industry does for my county. Lee County has about 75,000 people, and oil and gas provides over 18,000 good-paying jobs. Oil and gas production, it's the foundation of New Mexico's economy. We all know that, and it's by far the largest employer in southeastern New Mexico. Some of the particulars here are we have 844 teachers and 37 schools in Lee County. The oil and gas industry provides over $46 million a year to fund our K through 12 schools, and it also provides $2.2 million in funding for higher education in Lee County. So you can see that our education system is highly dependent on the oil and gas industry. But we also have 40 megawatts of solar and 50 megawatts of wind energy. So we do embrace all of it here in Lee County. You know, our small businesses depend on sales of their goods and services to the folks that work in the oil and gas industry. So again, you know, our whole economy surrounds the oil and gas industry here. Last year, oil and gas provided $2.8 billion to the state budget and $1.4 billion for public schools and higher education. We all know that we are a state that benefits greatly from our natural resources. So I guess today what I really want to say, besides give you a little bit of what's going on in Lee County, you know, we all want a clean environment. We live here, and that's very, very important to us. And what I'm asking the board to consider is regulation that allows the oil and gas industry to continue providing this large volume of jobs while investing in new technology and equipment that promotes a clean environment. Flexible regulatory approaches recognize and encourage the adoption and development of creative solutions to reduce emissions. And we are all about reducing emissions, and we are good partners, and we want to continue to be good partners with everyone in New Mexico. So I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Long. I believe I just saw Senator Pope join the platform, so we'll go back to Senator Pope. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I can hear you clearly. If you would please spell your name for the record.
Harold, last name Pope, Pope, and JR for Junior.
Thank you very much. If you would raise your right hand, do swear or affirm to tell the truth.
I do.
Thank you. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Good afternoon. My name is Senator Harold Pope Jr., representing District 23 in Northwest Albuquerque and Bernalillo County. I would like to thank the Environmental Improvement Board for the opportunity to provide comment. I would like to give full support of Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's call for nation-leading oil and gas pollution rules. In order for this to become a reality, though, the EIB must strengthen the New Mexico Environment Department's proposed ozone precursor rules to protect those living closest to development. Oil and gas pollution are negatively impacting our air, water, and health, but rural communities, tribal communities, children, and even our elderly are especially at risk. I think there's around 130,000 New Mexicans that live within about a half mile of oil and gas development, including communities of color and the BIPOC community, which disproportionately impact them with climate change and air pollution. Leaks due to equipment malfunction and lack of maintenance account for about 70% of oil and gas industry's emissions statewide. I'm encouraged by the fact that leading producers at the federal and state level are standing up to support firm regulations that cut pollution and methane and protect our communities. This will ensure that New Mexico's regulations lead the nation, which is also important when the EPA considers federal rules. Setting strong rules at the state level sets a good bar for forthcoming federal methane rules that can help protect New Mexicans, even from states like Texas, whose regulations are limited. New Mexico can lead and show the nation how to protect our air, water, and health. I would like to commend the NMED once again for putting forward a strong proposal. I would propose adding 3 critical improvements that the EIB should make to protect communities and address major sources of pollution. 1, I'd like to see more protections to those living closest to development by requiring more frequent inspections to find and fix leaks. Number 2, that we ensure strong requirements for operators to control pollution during the completion of an oil and gas well, as well as when they redevelop these wells. And finally, 3, strengthen the requirements to cut pollution from pneumatic controllers that are used in oil and gas production. Many of these emission leaks are avoidable, and we can avoid many of the serious health problems that many in our frontline communities are facing, especially those in the BIPOC communities. Emissions from oil and gas operations contain toxic, even deadly gases like hydrogen sulfide, toluene, xylene, and benzene. Methane leaks also release volatile organic compounds, which can also be building blocks for many of the ozone pollution that we're really concerned with, which can also harm our respiratory system, trigger asthma attacks, and worsen emphysema. I speak to you today not only as an elected official, but also as a voice for our youth that is asking us to do more to protect our environment and health. Thank you once again for the work that you're doing and giving me this opportunity to speak.
What did I just do? Thank you, Senator. Excuse me. Let me go to George Greenlee. I don't see Mr. Greenlee by name. I think I saw a call-in user. Caller 13, please tell us your name. Caller 13? All right. That's the only call-in user. I'll move then to Elizabeth Ortega. See if Ms. Ortega is on the platform. No. And then Lori Walters. Oh, I see Ms. Walters. Ms. Walters, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. If you would please spell your name.
It's Lori, and my last name's Walters.
Thank you, and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Okay, thank you again. My name is Lori Walters, and I work for a small company called San Juan Resources, whose main operations are located in New Mexico. And my background is I've been working in the financial accounting side of oil and gas for over 25 years. I'm speaking here today to provide a viewpoint from a small business perspective and U.S. citizen of the current regulations on methane emissions. I am concerned that additional administrative burden will have a major impact on small business and may ultimately put many small oil and gas operators in a situation where they may need to prematurely plug and abandon wells due to regulations for costly equipment upgrades and additional administrative and reporting requirements. According to the New Mexico Tax Research Institute, oil production could drop by 13% and natural gas production could drop by 23%. This would greatly impact New Mexico budgets with decreased revenue and increased unemployment for oil field workers. Every citizen wants a clean environment, and I think the U.S. does a pretty good job of keeping a clean environment in the U.S. These type of mandates in New Mexico and the U.S. do not even consider the methane emissions from foreign developing countries like China and Russia. Since foreign countries manufacture many of our products used in the U.S. with limited environmental regulations, the U.S. is in effect transferring their consumed methane emissions to foreign countries. This is really a U.S. consumption problem. U.S. manufacturers like oil and gas companies are at a huge disadvantage compared to these foreign companies, since the U.S. companies are required to install costly equipment and implement additional regulation procedures. There is an ultimate price that will be paid by the U.S. consumer, primarily the lower and middle class with higher oil and gas prices and dependence on foreign countries for a critical energy supply. As a parent, I want my children to do better than me. I would guess that's the American dream. I am deeply concerned these type of mandates and the rising U.S. debt will ultimately cripple this American dream. I would like to conclude as an employee of a small business. The small business exemption is critical in any final rule. Larger businesses can implement certain regulations more readily because they can purchase equipment in large quantities, potentially discounted under a contract. Large businesses can hire additional personnel to help in reporting such mandates. For a small business who operate under conservative budgets, these type of mandates could ultimately cripple their business model. Small businesses are so critical to the U.S. and New Mexican economies that a crippling of these businesses could have far-reaching, devastating consequences to the economy as a whole. Small businesses are like the small cells in the human body. Each cell supports the body as a whole, just as small businesses support the general overall economy. On a personal note, I have seen the small business I worked at, support me while I was sick with cancer. Although small businesses are exempt under the mandates when it comes to family leave, my company did everything they could to support me during this time. This is what small business do. They support their employees and they support their local economies. Instead of the local government issuing burdening regulations on small business, it's time for governments like New Mexico to support small business and its citizens who work for these companies. I feel the American dream is at stake. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walters. We go now to Shelly Manlev. Let's see, here we go. I've unmuted you.
Thank you so much. My name is Shelly Manlev. Can you hear me?
Hold on. Would you spell your name, please?
Sure. Shelly, Shelley, MANN-LEV as in Victor.
Thank you, and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to the Environmental Improvement Board who is considering this testimony and making these important decisions. My name is Shelly Manlev, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president of the New Mexico Public Health Association. The mission of the New Mexico Public Health Association is to promote public health practice, policies, and systems that support health equity in New Mexico. We have over 500 members, public health practitioners, and students who are all deeply committed in their work and education lives to supporting the well-being of all New Mexicans and to address disparities, health equity issues that negatively impact those who are most vulnerable and under-resourced. The issues at stake here, ozone, pollution, methane emissions, deeply, deeply impact our communities and impact health equity in New Mexico. I know you've heard many statistics and that you are all aware of the large numbers of New Mexicans who are directly impacted, and of course why you are present here and doing this work, that we are dealing with emissions and compounds that have both immediate health impacts and long-term health impacts for everyone. Those communities that are most immediately impacted, the children and elderly and communities of color, Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latinx communities, many people in those communities already are suffering from those health impacts, and we have got to, as a state, as a nation, as a world, do everything that we can to minimize those harmful impacts and protect the well-being and health of those who are most vulnerable. Ozone, methane emissions, we know that methane in particular has one of the strongest impacts on global climate change, the global climate emergency that we find ourselves in today. I want to again, as one of the other people who testified, speak to and appreciate the work that's been done by Governor Lujan Grisham and the New Mexico Environmental Department, and urge that we take this critical opportunity to do all that we can in terms of our rules and regulations to reduce the major sources of pollution, and to add in the 3 things I've heard you mentioned before as well, to protect those living closest to development by requiring more frequent inspections to find and fix leaks. Rules that don't have inspections aren't necessarily followed. It's difficult to change long-standing behaviors and practices, and so we need both inspections and enforcement to ensure that the rules that we adopt will in fact be implemented. The second area is to ensure that strong requirements are in place for all operators. It needs to be an equitable playing field to control pollution during the completion of an oil or gas well as when they redevelop an existing well. And finally, the third area, opportunity to strengthen the current requirements, is to cut pollution from pneumatic controllers that are used in oil and gas production. These devices are the second largest source of oil and gas methane emissions in New Mexico, and we need to, in New Mexico, for the Environment Department to require companies to inspect these pneumatics for leaks and accelerate the timeline to retrofit equipment with zero bleed or zero emission pneumatic controllers. As a dedicated public health professional who has spent decades in New Mexico caring for the well-being of children in particular and all New Mexicans, I know firsthand how much our communities have suffered from air pollution and climate change. I want to thank you again for considering how we can provide even stronger leadership for our state and for our country, especially for those who are most vulnerable. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Manlev. We look for Patricia Stern next. Don't see Patricia Stern. Jonathan Senna, Jonathan Senna. Mr. Senna, I've unmuted you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Miss Orth. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. If you would spell your name, please.
Yes, ma'am. Jonathan, Jonathan, Senna, Sena.
Thank you. And if you would raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Thank you. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank the members of the board for this time. We appreciate your leadership and your due diligence in this process. Again, my name is Jonathan Senna, and I live in Hobbs, New Mexico. I am a youth pastor at a local church and a county commissioner here in Lee County. I was born and raised in New Mexico, and I am native New Mexican on my father's side. My family has lived and worked in New Mexico for generations, literally hundreds of years. New Mexico is my home. The oil and gas industry provides me, through our funding from parishioners at church and to the county, it provides for my family and it provides for me. And I'm so grateful for that. And it provides for so many people in Lee County and throughout New Mexico, directly and, in my case, indirectly. The oil and gas industry pays for the roads that I use to drive my daughter Camila to preschool during the day, and it pays for the parks where I take her to play. The oil and gas industry, it pays for the diverse police officers, firefighters, and county deputies, EMS staff members who serve to keep my family safe every day. The industry supports education, supports first responders, and supports healthcare in our community. The industry is filled with people who want to work hard, are used to good, solid, level regulations, and they want to do it right. And that's what I see. And I see that the oil and gas industry provides jobs for every demographic of our community, especially the Latino community. Our people are hard workers and are grateful for the good salaries they receive from the oil and gas industry. And this in turn provides tax dollars for other jobs, other forms of economic development in our community. In Lee County, we do not have the mountains and rivers that are available in other parts of New Mexico. What we do have is extraordinary people. And we have also the support of the oil and gas industry to provide jobs, tax dollars to support teachers and police officers and firefighters. The oil and gas industry helps us to build schools and parks and opportunities for our families to move from poverty to self-sufficiency through good jobs. Now, look, I genuinely believe that our state can have fair rules while still reducing emissions and continuing to strengthen our state's biggest and most successful industry. It's important to get feedback from oil and gas producers. Look, we don't want unintended consequences like shutting in significant production volumes or even putting small producers out of business. These unintended consequences can harm minority-owned small business owners, people who are my friends and family members and people I go to church with. Oil and natural gas production is a major part of the foundation for our state's economy. And I believe it's critical that the state rules permit the oil and gas industry to continue to grow, create jobs for families, to attract investment, and to provide critical funds for our state budget and public schools, while absolutely still making sure our families are safe. The oil and gas industry is proactively working to limit emissions of methane and other greenhouse gases. Producers are investing. I see it. Producers are investing in new technology and equipment and adopting the leading best practices in different operations. And I believe that flexible regulatory approaches recognize and encourage this adoption and this type of development in regard to creative solutions to reduce emissions. So I want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your leadership and your service to the state of New Mexico. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Santa. See, we'll go next to Jesse Barnes. I unmuted you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, terrific. Hello, if you would spell your name, please.
JESSEBARNES.
Thank you, and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Thank
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Jesse Barnes. I'm a family medicine physician currently based in Albuquerque, and I've spent the last 14 years working all around New Mexico, providing primary care. For the last 3 years, I've been a member of a new group called Primary Care Advocates for Healthy Communities, along with a couple dozen of my fellow primary care providers, also with experience working all around New Mexico. We started the group because we've discovered in the course of our work that there are issues much larger than what we can address during our clinical visits with patients that have a huge impact on their health. Obviously, the quality of air that people breathe in communities around New Mexico is one of those issues. The science is clear. The medical science is not debatable. Poor air quality worsens diseases such as asthma, COPD, emphysema, and bronchitis, and has a very real impact on our communities. It tends to target the most vulnerable members of our communities, children who suffer from reactive airway disease and asthma, elders who have diseases like COPD, and it tends to target people of color who are disproportionately affected by the location of these industries that pollute our air quality. The American Lung Association has given 3 New Mexico counties an F grade for ozone pollution this year. Our communities should not have to choose between economic development and health. Responsible regulations are necessary to ensure that every New Mexican is able to breathe healthy air and that industry does not pollute our air quality and damage the health of New Mexicans. I'm very grateful to the governor and the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Department for taking this issue seriously. I don't want to repeat in depth what Senator Pope and others have already mentioned, but we call for continuing strong regulations and identify 3 areas in which we think these regulations need to be strengthened. That includes protecting frontline communities by requiring more frequent inspections, ensuring protection during well completion and when redeveloping existing wells, and strengthening requirements to cut pollution from the pneumatic controllers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes. I will go then to Sanders Moore, who reached out through chat. Let me see here. I've unmuted you. Can you hear me? Hello? Sanders Moore. May have stepped away. All right. I have rechecked for those names I called earlier and don't see them on the platform. Let's see here. I'll try unmuting Sanders Moore one more time. Hello, can you hear me? No, it's not working. Sanders Moore is saying I cannot unmute myself on my end. I've done what I can on the platform. We do have several more public comment sessions. So in the event you're able to rejoin us at 5-9-105 any day, please rejoin us. Thank you. All right, let's return to the technical case. Mr. Heiser or Ms. Katz, if you'd rejoin us on screen. Mr. Heiser, I would ordinarily go to you at this point for Mr. Smitherman's testimony or Mr. Myers' testimony.
Mr. Myers is not a witness on this issue for us.
Okay.
I think the only witness we have is Mr. Smitherman.
All right. And are you ready to present Mr. Smitherman, or will we be coming back?
I think it'd be better if we came back, if that's okay.
All right, that's fine. Okay. So let's go to, do we go to Davis then for IPA&M?
Madam Hearing Officer, I don't believe excuse me, I don't believe we have any testimony on this issue. Mr. Davis testified as to the application of LDAR to facilities yesterday in connection with that testimony. So I don't think we had any testimony directly with LDAR itself.
All right, thank you. So I believe we go to Mr. Holderman for Oxy.
Madam Hearing Officer, I'm policing up Mr. Holderman right now. He was down the hall on another phone call. We anticipated there being 2 more witnesses between us and them, but if you bear with me for a moment, I think we can get Mr. Holderman over here.
Thank you.
Madam Hearing Officer, while we're waiting for Mr. Holderman, if it's okay with you, I could go ahead and present Mr. Copeland.
All right, how do you feel about that, Mr. Jano?
It shouldn't take more than 1 minute.
I'm all in favor, Ms. Sheehan.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right.
Mr. Copeland's direct written pre-filed testimony, which is GCA Exhibit 15, addressed the GCA's proposed modest amendments to the department's default monitoring requirements as set forth in the department's May 6th version of the rule at section 116C1E. Since that time, NMED has addressed the GCA's concerns with this provision in NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 23. Given this cooperation and in an effort to streamline this proceeding, if parties or board members have questions for Mr. Copeland, he's available to answer those. Otherwise, the GCA is satisfied with the admission of Mr. Copeland's resume and testimony, GCA Exhibits 15 and 16 respectively, into the record as support for Section 116C as set forth in NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 23.
Wow, thank you very much, Ms. Sheehan. Let me pause a moment in the event any party would like to turn on their camera for questions of Mr. Copeland. Not seeing anyone. Board members, please wave a hand if you think you would have a question. No. All right, thank you very much, Ms. Sheehan. I think we're going to move along then. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Let's see if Mr. Jano got a hold of Mr. Holderman. Otherwise, we could take Ms. Nolting next.
Let's move forward with Ms. Nolte. Mr. Holderman is finishing up what he needed to finish up and should be about 5 or 10 more minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Jano. Ms. Gutierrez, and let's see.
I believe Ms. Nolting is ready as well.
I believe I made her a panelist. There you are. Go ahead.
And thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Could you please give me screen share permissions? See if I can improve my ability to do this time. Okay. Are we looking at a slide deck? Great, thank you. Ana Gutierrez with Hogan Lovells on behalf of Kinder Morgan. This is testimony relating to equipment leaks, and this relates to Kinder Morgan's direct technical testimony at Exhibit 7, as well as Exhibit 15. Ms. Nolting, as your qualifications have already been presented to the board, can you please introduce yourself for the record?
Yes, my name is Leslie Nolting, and I am an EHS manager at Kinder Morgan, focusing on air permitting and compliance.
Thank you. And did you submit written direct technical testimony at Exhibit 7 and rebuttal technical testimony at Exhibit 15 regarding leak detection?
Yes.
Do you have any changes to that testimony? And if not, do you adopt that testimony in full today?
I have no changes to my testimony, and yes, I adopt it in full.
Thank you. Could you please summarize for the board your testimony regarding leak detection and Kinder Morgan's particular request for the board's consideration?
Yes. Good afternoon, Madam Hearing Officer, Madam Chair, and members of the board. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you. As you have heard from the department, Kinder Morgan and EDF engaged on the issue of leak detection. As a result of that engagement, to understand each party's priorities, Kinder Morgan and EDF propose a joint proposal for leak detection at transmission compressor stations. I will be brief because, as NMED testified, we understand that the department plans to incorporate this joint proposal to an updated red line, and we have heard no objections from other parties. Under the joint proposal, transmission compressor station operators would have two alternative compliance options. They could either conduct quarterly monitoring, or they could comply with federal new source performance standards with an important caveat. In order to take advantage of this second compliance option, the federal standards must be at least as stringent as the version of the NSPS Quad OA in effect on the effective date of Part 50, which is quarterly. The priority purpose for the joint proposal is twofold. First, to ensure operators are inspecting stations at an appropriately regular frequency, in particular here, considering that the fugitive VOC emissions at transmission compressor stations are very low. And second, to eliminate the unnecessary challenges associated with complying with a state LDAR program and a separate and competing federal LDAR program. I'm going to move through a few slides rather quickly, but I can answer any questions after if there is any follow-up. This slide breaks down the emissions profile of one of our stations. The key point here is that while the station on the whole exceeds the VOC PTE thresholds proposed in the original NMED proposal, requiring monthly LDAR, the fugitive emissions component of that total, which is what we would inspect for at leak during LDAR surveys, are typically well below 1 ton per year facility-wide. Because of this extremely low VOC profile, monthly monitoring breaks down to approximately $17,004 per ton of VOC reduced, which is simply not cost-effective. The second key goal of the joint proposal is to avoid unnecessary overlap and competition with federal leak detection programs. It is extremely resource intensive with no emissions benefit to manage compliance with two leak detection programs with different requirements. This chart shows just a few of the competing obligations between the state and federal program. With that, we believe that the joint proposal between Kinder Morgan and EDF, as shown on the screen, is reasonable, and we ask the board to adopt it.
Thank you, Ms. Nolting. Does that conclude your summary of direct and rebuttal testimony on this topic?
Yes.
And in the spirit of streamlining this hearing, we're going to just quickly move through Sir rebuttal as well. As for Sir rebuttal, Ms. Nolting, did EDF present data and calculations in their rebuttal testimony at Exhibit JJJ related to the potential emissions they estimated from transmission compressor stations resulting from inspections less frequently than monthly?
Yes.
And specifically, did EDF assert that accepting the changes proposed by NMOGA and Kinder Morgan originally for semi-annual and quarterly leak detection at transmission compressor stations and gathering and boosting instead of quarterly and monthly would result in up to 8,400 additional tons of VOC emissions per year released and up to 34,000 additional tons of methane emissions per year released?
Yes, that's correct.
And although Kinder Morgan worked closely with EDF to develop this joint proposal, do you agree with the calculations and assumptions related to transmission compressor stations?
No, we do not. There were just some basic assumptions that were, I don't believe were correct. Using a more reasonable set of assumptions, if transmission compressor stations conducted quarterly or semi-annual leak detection instead of monthly or quarterly, the differential between the two sets of frequencies would only result in an additional approximately 6.5 tons per year of uncontrolled VOC emissions released from transmission compressor stations. To be clear, we remain supportive of the joint proposal between Kinder Morgan and EDF, and we appreciate EDF's engagement on this important issue. However, for purposes of the record, we do feel it's important to state that Kinder Morgan does not agree with the assumptions and the calculations reflected in EDF's exhibit JJJ. And while I've prepared slides and talking points to offer more detail on our specific concerns with EDF's analysis, in the interest of time, I will refer the board to my slide deck on this topic, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have regarding our concerns with EDF's analysis on this issue.
Thank you, Ms. Nolting, and I offer Ms. Nolting for cross-examination and questions.
Thank you, Ms. Nolting and Ms. Gutierrez. Parties, if you have questions of Ms. Nolting, please turn on your camera. I'm not seeing anyone. I'm going to turn to the board for their questions while I'm doing that. If you're an attendee on this platform and have a question, please reach out through chat. Madam Chair, do you have questions of Ms. Nolting?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I don't have any questions, but I just want to say, thank you to both parties, EDF and to Kinder Morgan, even though we have some dispute, if you will, debate over the base numbers, that you could come to a resolution on language. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
I don't have any questions at this time, but I'd also like to thank Ms. Nolting for the testimony that she submitted. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Bitzer.
No questions. Thank you.
Member Garcia. No questions. And Member Honker.
No questions.
Well, thank you very much. I don't imagine there's any need for redirect, Ms. Gutierrez. Thank you. Thank you both. I see Mr. Jano on the screen. Mr. Jano, do we have Mr. Holderman?
We are ready to go, Madam Hearing Officer.
Terrific. Have him turn on his camera. Oh, no, he's sitting next to you, isn't he?
We're the swap out team. I wish I could get the technology fixed. I honestly do.
It's not bad. It's not bad.
We have tried literally everything.
Oh, it's fine. Go ahead.
Madam Hearing Officer, Madam Chair, and members of the board, Mr. Holderman will be speaking on the equipment leak and fugitive emissions program today. 3 areas that Mr. Holderman will cover. First, proposal for exclusions on low emitting facilities. Second, provisions on the allowance of alternative monitoring. And third, provisions on monitoring in occupied areas. Much of this has been addressed in a joint proposal that was provided by OXY and the ENGOs that has been submitted to the board as well. Will be covered both in Mr. Holderman's testimony as well as in the testimony of other of the environmental groups. So I will turn it over to Mr. Holderman. Mr. Holderman, could you please summarize your direct and rebuttal testimony in connection with section 116?
Yes. As I've discussed in my prior testimony, this is another topic where many, but not all, of OXY USA's concerns have been addressed through coordination and open dialogue with the department and other stakeholders. Although the department has resolved OXY USA's concerns with leak repair requirements, OXY USA continues to believe that the rule should provide exclusions for low emitting facilities and include alternate leak monitoring methods. OXY USA also supports additions by EDF and the other ENGOs on this topic related to occupied areas. Regarding low emitting facilities, cost of conducting leak surveys at facilities such as satellite facilities, injection facilities, and wellhead only facilities far outweigh the minimal risk of leaks at these locations. OXY USA requests that the proposed rule be modified to include modified inspection requirements for inactive wellhead sites while maintaining an exemption for other facilities with little or no potential for leaks. As noted in my previous testimony, OXY USA has proposed definitions for satellite facilities and temporarily abandoned wellhead sites, along with an updated definition of wellhead site in section 7, that excludes injection well sites and wellhead only. The department's rebuttal testimony version of the language filed on September 7th included a one-time inspection requirement for facilities with the potential to emit under 2 tons per year, as well as a phase-in of 2 years for existing facilities. These would have helped resolve many of my concerns. However, the department has dropped the one-time inspection requirements from the September 16th version of the rule and only retained the 2-year phase-in. I encourage the board to instead either accept Oxy USA's prior proposals that excluded low-emitting facilities, including wellhead-only sites, or implement a phased-in annual inspection requirement for wellhead-only facilities. Although Oxy USA continues to prefer its proposal excluding these facilities, using the department's September 16th proposal as a basis for the second opinion, Oxy USA would propose that owners or operators of existing wellhead-only facilities continue annual inspections of these existing sites beginning 2 years after the effective date of this part on the following schedule: 30% by January 1st, 2024, an additional 35% by January 1st, 2025, and another 35% by January 1st, 2026. The second option is consistent with EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA's proposals in their September 19th submittal. Oxy USA also included this proposal in its September 24th file. Turning to alternative monitoring, Oxy USA supports the department's proposal to allow for alternative leak monitoring plans in Section 116D, and also requests that the department allow for alternative methods to be utilized. As an example, Oxy has been piloting sensor-based technology to electronically capture gas emissions, audio data, and visual data from locations as an alternative compliance method to AVO inspections. This method has the potential to be a more cost-effective and accurate form of data capture than traditional AVOs, which can enable greater emission reduction. Alternative technologies have the potential to result in more rapid identification and response than AVO inspection. Finally, as noted in my rebuttal testimony, Oxy USA is also supportive of additional monitoring obligations for wellhead sites within 1,000 feet of an occupied area, as requested by EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA. Oxy USA would incorporate this approach with the following updates. First, that a definition of occupied area that covers a building or structure used as a place of residency rather than designed for use as a place of residency. Second, a description of the process to measure the 1,000-foot distance. And finally, a timeline for owners and operators to evaluate whether any occupied areas are within 1,000 feet of the facility. EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA have included these clarifications in their filings, and we appreciate and support their changes. While this proposal is workable for Oxy USA's New Mexico operations with the modifications discussed, can't speak for whether it's feasible for every basin or for other operators in the state. I can only speak to Oxy's individual.
Mr. Holderman, I'm sorry to interrupt here. You may have mentioned it, but what exhibit were you referring to?
Mr. Holderman's 2 exhibits are Oxy USA Exhibit number 2, which is his direct testimony, and Oxy Rebuttal Exhibit number 2, which is his rebuttal testimony. In addition, we had made a separate filing like Kinder Morgan and EDF on the 24th that included alternative proposed language. Additionally, the environmental NGOs have also submitted a similar one-pager type submittal to the those have not been entered as exhibits.
Thank you. I think that was some of the confusion that not bad confusion, just some of this is exhibits and some of it is filings. Thank you.
And we present Mr. Holderman for cross-examination.
All right, thank you. Let me ask if there are parties with questions of Mr. Holderman. Please turn on your camera. I see Mr. Heiser.
Good afternoon, Mr. Holderman.
Good afternoon.
I'm Eric Heiser. I'm representing the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. And I wanted to touch on an aspect of your testimony that you just gave as reflects a change in the wording of this agreement with Oxy and a number of the environmental non-governmental organizations. And in that change in the agreement, you agreed to change places that are used for residency from those that are designed for residency. Is that correct?
That's our proposal, yes.
And when Oxy is making that change, what frequency of review are you anticipating that Oxy would be undertaking to ask that there would be no use of an area for residency within 1,000 feet of any of its areas? Because can't that change depending on whether somebody sets up a tent or something like that in that area?
Yeah, I believe we asked for annually to review.
So you're thinking an annual review. Okay.
Well, I guess I'll say that we asked for a timeline to be able to go evaluate those areas, and then that we would confirm any areas identified annually hadn't changed.
Okay, and so is it your envision that this is one time or annual or evergreen, I guess?
I mean, it would have to be evergreen, but once you've identified them and you're doing the inspections, at that point, it's up to you if you believe that they've changed status to go do that, or you can continue with the inspections. But yes, that's what we.
And in Oxy's experience, because you're, obviously a well-respected technical operator in this space, how long does it take you to set up a LDAR program for a facility that would have a person potentially move within that 1,000 feet from when you discovered it to how long would it take you to actually put that program up and have it available?
We would ask for 60 to 90 days. I think would be our standard approach.
Thank you very
much. Circumstance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holderman. That's helpful just to understand. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Other parties with questions of Mr. Holderman, please turn on your screen. I'll turn now to the board for their questions. While I'm doing that, if you're an attendee on this platform with a question, please reach out through chat. Madam Chair, any questions of Mr. Holderman?
Madam Chair, I don't have any questions.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
A couple, and actually, I thought Mr. Holderman would be the best person to answer, one of the best people to answer this question, but they kind of came up in some earlier testimony. So I was curious about your LDAR program, and not necessarily specifically Oxys, because I doubt you want to speak on that. You might want to speak generalized for most operators. But would you say that most operators have an LDAR program that they carry out for all their facilities?
I guess I've made every attempt to not to try to speak for every operator and only speak to Oxys. What I can say is that we do, and so in referencing our ability to react, when I said 60 to 90 days, that encompasses the fact that we do already have an LDAR program for most of our large facilities. So we are merely bolting on to an existing program. Starting from scratch would obviously take long.
And in that LDAR program, do you have
I guess I will say, in so much that operators, I can generalize this, in so much as operators have equipment and facilities built in a time frame that Quad OA applies to them, then they should have an LDAR program already established to meet that requirement. So that's a generalization I can make.
That's a helpful one. Thank you. And so in that program, do you grade it on like a pass or fail rate? Is that how you would look at
the way we execute our program is, I guess, twofold, and I'll happily speak to it. For Quad OA, we follow the requirements of Quad OA to capture it, because that's the technical basis for our voluntary LDAR program. We go out and inspect a site. It is pass fail. The things are either leaking or not. If we identify leaks, then we measure how long we get them repaired, and we go do a second closeout LDAR to make sure that we have no leaks until the next time we show up.
And do you set like internal company metrics for to improve your pass or fail rate? basically, are you looking back at your own performance with that program?
I guess I would say we do. I don't want to overstate the maturity of our LDAR program, and so I would characterize it that we've gathered enough information to know the frequency that we need to go out there, so that we're not doing tests that we don't capture anything repeatedly. I don't know that we've built up enough data to be able to extend, to say with any definitiveness that we've improved our PM program to prevent leaks at this point in time. That would be ideal. That's the route that we're going. But we're still on that path. So that's why I say we're currently mostly on a quarterly inspection basis for our large facilities, similar to what's.
Okay, thank you. And what I was kind of driving at with that was, or trying to understand was, we hear a lot about LDAR programs. We hear a lot about, putting these inspection programs into practice. And since the Quad OA LDAR is already in practice, I wanted to know more about how that was progressing and if it was evolving within the companies to improve, or if they were kind of status quo. And so I thank you for answering those questions for me. And if you have any more to add to that, I'd appreciate it.
I'm trying to think if I do or not. I don't think I could definitively say that LDAR has caused the failure rate of the equipment to go down. I mean, it doesn't fundamentally even touch the equipment, you know what I mean? And so to the extent that you can use LDAR to change the way that you service the equipment, to identify where we've heard a lot in the testimony that you have these incremental bad actors compared to, most equipment. The degree to where we can find the service situations or things where those bad actors are, LDAR is great for driving down our leak rate. But really it's a tool for us to identify where we need to do the work to drive down the emission rate. LDAR isn't, like I said, it isn't fundamentally touching anything. It's just telling you where your problems are and where you need to get people to fix equipment.
Thank you. I think that was a really enlightening explanation. So thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Garcia?
No questions. Thank you.
And Member Honker?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jano, did any of the questioning, does it prompt follow-up with Mr. Holderman for you?
Nothing further, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Holderman and Mr. Jano. I believe now we turn to EDF. Ms. Braños?
Thank you so much, Madam Hearing Officer. Elizabeth Praños here on behalf of EDF. With me today is Dr. David Lyon, who we heard from yesterday, Ms. Hillary Hull, and also Dr. Tammy Thompson, who we heard from a few days ago on the ozone photochemical modeling. Our first witness is going to be Dr. Lyon. I think he is with us, so as long as he's been turned into a presenter, he should pop up here any moment.
Hello, can you hear me?
Great. Yeah. Yes, we can. Thanks, David. Madam Hearing Officer, do you need to swear Dr. Lyon in again?
No, he remains under oath.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Dr. Lyon, you submitted direct and rebuttal testimony on behalf of EDF with respect to Section 116 equipment leaks. Is that correct?
Yes.
And do you have any corrections to that testimony?
Yes, I do.
Let's
So
mention
we
the
did just
exhibit numbers. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely. So Dr. Lyons' rebuttal testimony is XX, and we just filed an amendment to that. That's EDF Exhibit XX little a. His direct testimony is EDF Exhibit RR, and he will be discussing all of the exhibits, some of which were discussed yesterday, but those again would be EDF Exhibit A, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, Q, Q, R, R, Y, Y, Z, Z, and triple A. And I would move to admit those exhibits subject to the outstanding objection that we will be hearing about, I think, later today or tomorrow.
Yes, thank you. They're admitted subject to that objection.
Thank you. Dr. Lyon, could you please summarize the opinions in your direct testimony regarding EDF's LDAR proposal that requires additional inspections at well sites located near occupied places, such as schools, homes, and playgrounds?
Yes, EDF in conjunction with Clean Air Advocates, Oxy USA, and the Center for Civic Policy and NAVA Education Project proposed to require operators with wellhead sites.
Dr. Lyon, I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you would start again and speak much more slowly.
Yes. Yes, EDF in conjunction with Clean Air Advocates, Oxy USA, the Center for Civic Policy and NAVA Education Project proposed to require operators with wellhead sites located within 1,000 feet of occupied places such as schools, playgrounds, and homes inspect such facilities more frequently than otherwise would be required by NMED's proposal. Specifically, operators would be required to inspect well sites within 1,000 feet of occupied places quarterly if such well sites have the potential to emit less than 5 tons of VOCs. For well sites within this boundary that have the potential to emit 5 tons per year of VOCs, we recommend monthly inspections. We refer to this as the LDAR proximity proposal. This proposal will help protect frontline communities from excess emissions while also helping New Mexico avoid ozone non-attainment or a more serious ozone non-attainment designation.
And what is your opinion of NMOGA's proposal to reduce the inspection frequency proposed by NMED for well sites that have a potential to emit of less than 10 tons per year of VOCs?
I strongly disagree with this proposal. The calculation of a well pad's potential to emit is estimated primarily based on a well pad's oil and gas production. But scientific studies have shown, including one conducted in New Mexico Permian as early as recent as 2018, show that there's a weak relationship between well pad emissions and production, and that low producing wells can emit substantial amounts of VOC emissions, sometimes in excess of the potential of emit due to malfunctions such as a stuck separator dump valve that cause abnormally high emissions. Frequent inspections with instruments such as optical gas imaging cameras are necessary to mitigate emissions from these low producing wells.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. And could you describe the EDF studies of emissions from oil and gas operations that you participated in that took place in New Mexico?
Yes, and at this point, I'd like to share some slides, so if you can please give me permission.
While that's happening, I'm going to ask you to still speak slower, please.
Okay. Yes, so I'll be talking about some of EDF's research since 2018, some studies that were published in peer-reviewed journals, and particularly EDF's project since late 2019, the Permian Map project. So I'm going to share some slides now. Let's see. One second. Give me any PDFs up. All right, can you see those slides?
We can.
Great. One second. Apologies. Let me share the PDF instead, or the PowerPoint. Apologies for that. Hopefully now you can see the slides.
Again.
Great. So I'll be talking about Environmental Defense Fund Permian Methane Analysis Project, which is a research project, a campaign in the Permian Basin of New Mexico and Texas that collaborates with leading scientists to assess emissions of methane and VOCs and facilitate mitigation of those emissions. This project uses multiple measurement approaches in the Permian and has been ongoing since late 2019 and is continuing to go on. We actually have aircraft in the Permian today measuring emissions, and I'll talk in detail about some of the approaches that have been used and what we've learned. So I'll be talking about several measurement approaches being used to quantify emissions of methane and other pollutants. There is aerial mass balance and remote sensing by Scientific Aviation and Carbon Mapper, tower-based estimates of regional emissions by Pennsylvania State University, vehicle-based site-level estimates of well pad emissions by the University of Wyoming, and then helicopter-based optical gas imaging surveys by Leak Surveys Incorporated. And all of this data is publicly available on permianmap.org. So the first data I'll be talking about is estimates of the total methane emissions in the Permian Basin. So the study Zhang et al. 2020 used data from the satellite-based Traponi instrument to quantify methane emissions in the Permian and found that emissions were 2.9 million metric tons per year, which is equivalent to 3.7% of the natural gas production. So higher than natural averages, the natural average are much higher than EPA estimates. For Permian Map, EDF partnered with Scientific Aviation and Penn State University to come up with aircraft and tower-based estimates of methane emissions since about March 2020. So what we found is that in early 2020, emissions were about 3% of production, pretty similar to the earlier study. And then what we found was that when oil price crashed in April 2020, the emissions dropped to about 2% of production due to the drastic decrease in new well production and a decrease in gas flaring. But the emissions quickly rebounded and have since then have been about 3% and above. So really demonstrating that by using these measurement approaches, we find that the total emissions are much higher than estimates by EPA and others. The next data I'll be talking about are site-level measurements performed by a vehicle using an EPA-developed approach, Other Test Method 33A. So we partnered with scientists at the University of Wyoming, and they used their mobile research laboratory, first doing measurements in 2018 and then later doing measurements in 2020. So this data I'm talking about is from their 2018 measurements and were published in the paper Robertson et al. 2020. And in this paper, and what they did is they used this vehicle driving downwind of 71 sites, well pads in the New Mexico Permian, and quantified their emissions with an approach that can detect very low levels of emissions in addition to high emissions. So what they found was that methane emissions were about 5 to 9 times higher than estimates based on the EPA National Emissions Inventory and about 10 times higher than based on the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. One interesting finding is that the wellhead-only sites did tend to have much lower emissions than the complex sites, but they still did have emissions, so we think that this supports phasing in the inspections of these wellhead-only sites. The next approach I'll talk about are aerial and satellite detections of large emissions, sometimes called super emitters. So There's several approaches that have been used recently, including NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the University of Arizona, have flown their vehicle, their aircraft called Carbon Mapper, which uses remote sensing to quantify large emissions from sources that are over about 200 tons per year of emissions. So these are very large emission sources. And as you can see in the left, they can actually image the plume of the emissions. So you can see exactly which site the emissions are coming from. And often you can even see the equipment it's coming from, such as a tank or an unlit flare. And additionally, a recent paper, Irikudis Lopsiak et al. 2021, used 3 satellites to quantify even larger emissions, greater than, I think it's 4,000 tons per year, using satellites, and found over 30 of these really large sources in the Permian. And so all this data is very recent, and we actually have, next slide will show that EDF has used Carbon Mapper aerial surveys to survey the Permian, including the New Mexico portion, this August. And the aircraft found not over 900 methane plumes from 500 sources over this 200 tons per year. And many of the plumes had emissions detected over multiple surveys throughout 2 weeks. And many of them were the same sources that were emitting in 2019. But also a lot of sources were very intermittent. So you find high emissions during one survey, but they were gone the next survey, showing really that you need frequent inspections to find these large emitters. And also point out that the emissions were detected from a diversity of sites, including well pads, compressors, pipelines, and processing plants. And gathering compressor stations are one of the largest sources, contributing about 20% of emissions. Next data I'll talk about is helicopter-based optical gas imaging, which is you can use to visualize the normally invisible hydrocarbons, including VOCs and methane. So we partnered with Leak Surveys Incorporated. This is a contractor that's been doing OGI inspections for over 10 years. They have worked for several people, including NMED and EPA, doing inspections. And we've had them fly in the Permian on multiple surveys looking for unlit flares and other problems like you see here on the right. So this is showing a flare at a processing plant that should be combusting the VOCs and methane, but instead is unlit and venting all the gas to atmosphere. So we've performed over 5 surveys in the Permian. We actually have the helicopter flying right now, doing some more surveys. And we found consistently that about 5% of flares are unlit and venting. And another 5% have issues, such as you can see a hydrocarbon slip indicating that it's not burning the emissions properly. So we estimate that the combustion efficiency, the overall combustion efficiency, if you account for these malfunctioning flares, is no better than 93% compared to the 98% estimated by EPA, and that these flares contribute over 10% of the total emissions, showing that it's really important to make sure flares are maintained well and inspected. So that's all the slides I have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lyon. And do the findings from the Permian map studies correspond to findings from other studies that you've been involved in other basins in the U.S.?
Yes. So the findings in the Permian, they have a lot of consistencies with the rest of the U.S. But I will say the Permian is really the extreme. The Permian has some of the highest emissions encountered in the U.S., but the patterns are generally the same. So some of these really common findings are one is that emissions occur across the supply chain, including in transmission and compression and local distribution. But really the largest sources of emissions are upstream, particularly well pads and gathering stations. Second is that emissions always have what's called a skewed distribution. So that if you rank sources or sites by their emissions, the top 5 to 10% highest emitting sources or sites account for over half of the total emissions. And we find this is true no matter what kind of sites or sources you look at, that there's some of these super emitters. But the issue is these super emitters often are intermittent. They may occur for a day or hours or even minutes. And they can occur at all sites. So it's critical that sites are inspected to really define these super emitting sites. Additionally, another finding is that the traditional emission inventory approaches used by EPA, NMED, and operators, including for things like the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, tend to greatly underestimate emissions. And this is because they rely on emission factors and engineering equations that are either based on a very limited number of measurements or assume things are working correctly. So they may assume that a flare is combusting the emissions at 98%, but if the flare is unlit, it's combusting it at 0%. So the inventories often don't account for these what's really going on in the field. So it's why it's critical that you use measurements to estimate emissions. So a paper published in the journal Science in 2018, Alvarez et al., was a kind of a meta-analysis summary, a lot of the EDF and other studies that we tried to come up with the best estimate of U.S. oil and gas methane emissions. So it included over 24 collaborating scientists. And what we found was that emissions in the U.S. In 2015 were 13 million metric tons of methane. That's about 2.3% of natural gas production. And it's about 70% higher than the EPA greenhouse gas inventory's current estimate. And really it's because of these super emitters that these inventory approaches are really underestimating emissions and then also underestimating the benefits that can be gained by mitigating those emissions.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon, and you've touched on some of this already, but I suppose the question is, why is it significant that measured emissions, as you found in the Permian Basin, are higher than those estimated by inventories, in particular for this rulemaking?
Yes, because since the rulemaking analyses, they're based on these bottom-up approaches, so they underestimate both the total emissions, they underestimate the mitigation, and then therefore they underestimate the benefits that can be gained by reducing the emissions.
Terrific, thank you. So turning now to the topic of cost effectiveness, your rebuttal testimony stated that NMED did not overestimate the pollution reductions that can be achieved through LDAR. Could you please explain the basis for that opinion?
Yes, so I reviewed ERG's estimate of emission reductions to result from the implementation of NMED's proposed LDAR rules. So ERG estimates that the approximately 24,000 well sites in New Mexico, subject to the proposed LDAR requirements, emit 7,131 tons of VOC that can be reduced by frequent inspections. And this is a gross underestimate of the pollution emitted from New Mexico well sites that can be mitigated by frequent instrument-based leak inspections if you use these measurement-based studies to estimate the emissions. So as noted in my testimony, the paper Robertson et al. 2020 used 2018 vehicle-based data from 71 sites in the Permian and found that the average emissions were about 37 tons of methane per year, equivalent to about 11 tons of VOC per year based on the RAP inventory's average gas composition. And that extrapolates to over 260,000 tons of VOC emitted per year from New Mexico Permian well pads, so much higher than official estimates. And other studies suggest that this estimate actually is quite low because the Robertson et al. Study used vehicles that would miss a lot of the elevated sources. So things like an unlit flare, the emission plume would actually pass over the vehicle and not be included. So we think it's actually a conservative estimate. And also see that IMOGA asserts that New Mexico facilities have less potential equipment leak emissions than EPA's model plant that ERG used to model the reductions associated with NMED's LDAR proposal. So IMOGA bases its assertion on reports operators submit to EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. And according to these reports, New Mexico facilities have less pieces of equipment and components and potential to emit than 2016 CTG model plants. But as I noted in my testimony, that these estimates, like model plants that are based on bottom-up emissions data, are inaccurate. And that if you use measurement-based approaches, you actually come to the opposite conclusion of IMOGA and find that NMED's estimate is an underestimate of the emissions.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. And if NMED's estimate of the emissions that can be reduced by frequent instrument-based inspections is an underestimate, underestimate, does that also mean that NMED's estimate of the reductions that can be achieved by frequent inspections is an underestimate?
Correct.
Thank you. And could you expound a little bit more on why you disagree with NMOGA's suggestion that well sites that have a PTE of less than 10 tons per year VOCs should be subject to less frequent, specifically annual instrument-based inspections?
Yes, because as I explained, there's really a poor relationship between production and emissions, and the PTE, the potential to emit, is primarily based on the production. Often the oil production go into the tanks, but those are really inaccurate reflections of the emissions from those sites. So I'll go over a few studies that really show how that marginal wells, which tend to have a low calculated potential to emit, can actually have quite high emissions. So the first study, Dayton et al. 2020, summarized direct measurements of methane and VOC emissions from marginal oil and gas wells, from the very marginal wells that were producing less than 1 barrel of oil equivalent per day. I believe the definition nationally is for 15 barrels of oil. So these are the most marginal wells. So measured these wells in the Appalachian Basin in southeastern Ohio and found that they were a disproportionate source of methane and VOC emissions. So these wells only accounted for 0.2% of oil and 0.4% of gas production produced in the US in the year, but they estimate they account for 11% of the upstream methane emissions. So it's a really negligible contribution to production, but a substantial fraction of the emissions. Amara et al. 2018 is a meta-analysis study of well pad emissions from 8 basins that also finds that marginal wells are a large contributor of emissions. So the researchers obtained site-level methane emissions data, primarily collected with the same approach as University of Wyoming, from over 1,000 natural gas production sites throughout the U.S. and looked at the characteristics of these wells and their emissions profile by production. So they categorized wells by categories, including based on their gas production, and found that the low natural gas production sites that were producing less than 100,000 cubic feet per day of natural gas accounted for 85% of the total number of sites in the study and nearly 2/3 of the total methane emissions. Also, many studies have identified that poor maintenance is a driver of observed methane leakage at marginal sites. For example, Dayton et al. Found that the state of maintenance at these wells was poor, and some sites were in a state of disrepair with rusty well shafts, broken valves, etc., while others were found to be venting as a result of fallen trees on the wellheads. Similarly, Amar et al. Reported rusted or corroded well casings, field piping, regulators, valves, or meters, and identified a few of these decrepit components as the substantial sources of leaks at the low production sites. So these avoidable methane emissions typically are not well represented in the traditional inventory calculations, and that is one of the large reasons that there's been discrepancies between these inventory-based estimates and measurement studies. So the studies I discussed here really indicate that low production wells are a disproportionate source of methane emissions nationally and in the Permian. For example, so really it's essential that these wells are inspected to find these emissions and reduce them.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. You mentioned the methane emissions that were studied. Is it true that methane is a component of natural gas and VOCs are also a component of natural gas?
Yes, so methane is the primary constituent of natural gas, but it often includes VOCs and sometimes has air pollutants, including benzene. So the EDF studies have generally focused on methane emissions, but since the VOCs and hazardous air pollutants are co-emitted with the methane, I believe that these studies, the same findings would apply to these other pollutants.
Thank you. And is it correct that EDF actually compiled a methane-specific inventory for New Mexico, but then we converted that inventory to VOCs for purposes of this rulemaking?
Yes.
Thank you. Turning now to some of the testimony we heard earlier today from Mr. Holderman. As Mr. Holderman mentioned, EDF did propose jointly with Oxy that low producing facilities low emitting facilities should either not be inspected at all as part of LDAR or should be inspected very infrequently. Do we agree that inactive wells, temporarily abandoned wells, and wellhead only sites should be subject to less frequent or no inspections as we have jointly proposed?
Yes, so these sites can have emissions, but they tend to much less frequently have large emissions. So I think it's reasonable to have a less have them phased in and have and we agree that they could be exempt from LDAR.
Great, and just to clarify, did we propose to exempt satellite facilities, injection wellheads, and temporarily abandoned sites from the instrument-based LDAR?
We did propose to exempt satellite facilities, injection wellhead sites, and temporarily abandoned wellhead sites.
And could you describe the joint proposal for LDAR with respect to inactive wellhead sites?
Yes, we propose that operators inspect these wellhead sites that become inactive after the rules take effect, no sooner than 30 days after the site becomes inactive. And subsequently, we propose annual inspections of wellhead sites. And this is because the inactive wells can leak, however, they're not as likely to leak as much or as frequently as actively producing wells.
Thank you. And then with respect to wellhead only sites, as has been proposed by EDF and Oxy, can you please summarize what the proposal is with respect to instrument-based leak detection?
Yes, we propose to require a phase-in of the annual inspection requirements for wellhead-only sites as follows. So for existing wellhead-only facilities, annual inspections shall be completed on the following schedule: 30% by January 1st, 2024, 65% by January 1st, 2025, and 100% by January 1st, 2026.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. And for the benefit of the board, that particular proposal was part of our joint notice of second revised amendments, which we filed on September 19th. And that concludes Dr. Lyon's summary of his direct and rebuttal. We do have some rebuttal, if I may proceed with that this time.
Yes, please.
Dr. Lyon, we heard earlier in the proceeding that the New Mexico Oil Conservation Commission venting and flaring rule and its AVO requirements reduce the need for frequent instrument-based inspections. Do you agree?
No, I do not agree. So I do not think that AVO is a substitute for instrument-based methods. AVO can occasionally detect emissions, particularly large emissions, but it's highly dependent on both the kind of skill and attention of the operator and the conditions in the environment, including things like the wind and are there other sources nearby that are loud or could make it difficult to hear or see emissions. I think that there's been people in industry that have made similar things, including there's been testimony from Jim Bolander during the OCC rulemaking last January that agreed with this point. I can bring up his testimony where you want, but basically the summary was they said LDAR is not meant to be a robust inspection and repair and reporting requirement, and that this is not a leak detection and repair program because we know that's out of our lane.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. And so just to clarify, you were just quoting, and it might actually be helpful to pull that up on your screen if you're able to, testimony from Jim Bolander, who was an Oil Conservation Division consultant during the New Mexico Oil Conservation Commission rulemaking last January. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I can share it briefly. I think.
Real quick for our benefit, is this in the record at this point?
This is not, we have not submitted this. This is part of our rebuttal testimony.
Go ahead.
Share it. Okay.
Well, I think it may be appropriate at this point to object on the basis of unfair surprise. If we did receive this information, it wouldn't have been until yesterday, and this looks quite extensive.
Ms. Paranos?
So this is Sir rebuttal. We honestly don't think it should be surprising since this was public testimony that was provided in January. This is directly responsive to NMOGA's argument that frequent monthly or weekly AVO inspections basically reduce the need to have frequent instrument-based inspections as the department has proposed. And so the only point we're trying to make here is that the New Mexico Oil Conservation Commission rule does not require leak detection and repair. It only requires AVO. And their own consultant specifically stated that AVO is not in any way a substitute for leak detection and repair.
Mr. Heiser?
Yeah, this is Mr. Curtis. I don't believe that there's any statement in the record to the effect that the OCD rule requires an LDAR program such as OGI and Method 21, and so it's unclear to the extent it's trying to rebut that there's a statement in the record as a basis for that rebuttal. Beyond that, it would seem more appropriate that this statement should be made on the strength of the witness's own experience and testimony as opposed to hearsay that we have not had access to up until now.
I think the way to proceed at this point will be Ms. Paranos for Mr. Lyon to refer to the testimony subject to the objection, and we will weigh that later. But I don't want to get bogged down in the argument just right now. Go ahead.
Go ahead and share it. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Yes, so I think Elizabeth, I believe this is the correct part, right? Let me know if I should go up.
Yes. Yeah, maybe just go up to the very top. So, yep, stop.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So is this, in this testimony, Dr. Lyon, is Mr. Bolander discussing the difference between AVO inspections, which are sensory-based inspections, and instrument-based inspections, which we tend to call LDAR or leak detection repair?
Yes.
Thank you. And if you could just show the highlighted portion, I think this is the most important part. This is Mr. Bolander himself. That's perfect right there. Who's simply providing his opinion as to whether or not the OCC AVO requirements are or are not LDAR. So, and Mr. Lyon and Dr. Lyon, in your opinion, based on your own knowledge, I think you have already stated that you do not believe AVO is as reliable in detecting leaks as instrument-based inspections. Is that an accurate summary of your testimony?
That is correct.
Thank you so much. I don't have any further questions for Dr. Lyon.
Thank you. I see Mr. Rose on the screen. Mr. Rose, questions of Dr. Lyon?
No questions of Dr. Lyon specifically, but in response to the question earlier by Mr. Curtis, it wasn't clear whether the OCD testimony or the OCC testimony that was being shown is going to be offered as an exhibit in this proceeding. And if it is, it seems to me that it needs to include the entire question and answer for context, because what we're seeing and what was shown on the screen is an excerpt from that testimony. It didn't show the question that was being asked or the response that was that this is directed to. So the board can't gauge the probity of that evidence without looking at the more complete statement. So we would ask that if it's going to be offered, it be offered in its that question and answer. If there are more questions and answers related to that, that they be offered in their entirety.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rose. Ms. Paranos, I think that's a good point. If you would please make your proffer just a little more than that one page.
Absolutely.
All right. I see Mr. Curtis on the screen.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, just a few questions for Dr. Lyon. Good afternoon. Appreciate you being with us today. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the studies that you referred to. And in particular, I wanted to ask you a few questions about Exhibit F, which is entitled New Mexico Permian Basin Measured Well Pad Methane Emissions are a factor of 5 to 9 times higher than US EPA estimates. So in the study, the authors, which as I understand included yourself, used a method referred to as Other Test Method, or OTM 33A. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And I'm going to butcher this as a non-technical person, but essentially it describes the method as you conduct rapid wind and methane mixing ratio directions over a minimum 20-minute period. So basically you're parking a vehicle with a probe that's downwind of a well site, and you're collecting data for a few minutes.
Yes.
Is that fair? Okay. And so in that study, you indicate that there are 71 facility measurements relied upon. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you categorize the results, those 71 measurements, into two categories. And my understanding is basically there were 42 measurements that you refer to as OTM 33A measurements, and then you have 29 that you refer to as below detection limit measurements. And my question is, did you apply a non-zero value to those values that were measured at below detection limit?
Yes, I believe the study did apply half of the detection limit to those sites, which was 0.04 kilograms per hour. So that's going to be, I think, less than a ton per year.
So in fact, there were no emissions measured for 29 out of the 71 measurements that are a part of the study.
Correct. For those sites, the emissions were below detection limit.
Okay. You also indicated that for some of these measurements, the evaluation was only conducted for approximately 5 minutes as opposed to 20 minutes. Is that correct?
Oh, for that study, the below detection limit sites were only monitored for 5 minutes. So if elevated methane was detected, they waited the entire 20 to 30 minutes to measure emissions. But if they did not see elevated methane, for the speed of the project to try to get as many sites as possible, they decided the site was below detection limit.
Okay. So let's assume that each of the measurements were the result of a 20-minute observation. You've indicated that that's not the case. Some of them were only for 5 minutes. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that they were all 20 minutes. And so that gives us, in order to quantify the total measurement time, we would simply multiply 71 by 20 minutes. Is that right?
The emissions are reported in kilograms per hour, so you could multiply by 8,760 if you wanted to estimate annual emissions.
What I'm trying to understand is how much actual monitoring data formed the basis for the study. And so conservatively, we have 71 measurements at 20 minutes apiece, correct?
Yes.
And that's approximately, we'll say, 1,420 minutes, less than 24 hours total. Okay. And so you're taking each measurement, which lasts at most 20 minutes, and you're extrapolating it to determine a annual emission rate, which is 8,760 hours, correct?
Yes.
And then on a larger scale, you're taking less than 24 hours of data to project the emissions for the entire Permian Basin on an annual basis.
We use the 24 hours to estimate emissions for a year, assuming that the 2 weeks of those measurements was representative of the year.
And you did that for the entire Permian Basin, right?
No, just the New Mexico portion of the Permian.
Just the New Mexico portion. Okay. And how much would you say you covered geographically in New Mexico in conducting this study? What percentage of geographic space was this accounting for?
Less than 1%.
Thank you. So in your testimony, you spoke quite a bit about the inadequacy of some of the emission estimation methodologies used by the greenhouse gas reporting inventory that EPA collects. And so it sounds like you're generally familiar with the procedures that are used to estimate emissions in that context.
Yes.
And you mentioned some things like mass balance engineering equations, emission factors that are based on measurement data from EPA or other studies. Is that correct?
Yes.
And do you have a sense for how many hours of measurement data underlies those emission factors or emissions estimation methodologies on any given year across the Permian Basin?
It depends which factor you're talking about. Some of the emission factors used in the EPA greenhouse gas reporting program are based on, I believe, less than 20 measurements collected in the 1990s. Some of those were actually collected for different facility types as they're being used for emission factors.
So let's look at this globally, right? Because we want to compare apples to apples. So the apple that we're comparing is the 24 hours of measurement that was conducted in your study. The other apple we're comparing is all of the data collected by all of the owners and operators for the entire year in the Permian Basin. What does the hour comparison look like?
I'm not sure what you're talking about. If you mean the hours that people are entering numbers in a spreadsheet, yes, there's more labor that goes into the emission inventory approach. But I think they're using flawed assumptions so that they're not actually estimating the emissions. So I think you can't compare hours fairly.
Let's take, for example, measurements on the inlets of devices. Aren't we measuring flow in that instance? Aren't we measuring VOC concentrations?
Yes, those are good measurements, but they're not used very often, except for transmission facilities are required to use measurements for the reporting program. But for most production sources, they're not using measurements.
But you would agree that there are quite a bit of facility-specific site measurements that underlie the greenhouse gas reporting numbers that are reported.
Only for a very limited of emission sources and a limited number of segments. So mostly transmission, reciprocating compressor, and centrifugal compressor, some of those vent emissions or measurements. There are some approaches like well completions and liquids unloading that operators are given the option of using measurements, but to my knowledge, less than 1% of operators actually use the measurement approaches.
So let's turn to the emission factors that are commonly used in the greenhouse gas reporting context. Would it surprise you to know that many of these emission factors statistically include large emitters that were observed during the test phases of developing that emission factor?
If you mean kind of the earlier GRI study from the 1990s, yes, I'm aware that there are some large sources in some of the factors.
Thank you. And so I want to talk about a little bit about your assertion that emissions estimates from your study indicate that total methane is 5 to 9 times greater than what's reported. Part of the way you come to that conclusion is you assume that EPA accounts for 95% of emissions in the greenhouse gas reporting inventory, correct?
Yes.
And has EPA said that it accounts for 95% of emissions from each sector, or is it simply said that it accounts for 95% from the inventory overall?
You're right. You're right. That is an issue with the paper. I've later learned that it's probably more like 60 to 70% is estimated by the reporting program for oil and gas. So I think it would be probably less than 5 to 9, but still would be substantially higher than reporting program-based estimates.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And is that clarification included in your testimony at any point, or is it true that you represent the assertions of that study are in fact accurate with respect to 5 to 9 times?
I would say that I was citing the peer-reviewed paper and have learned since then that the assumptions in that peer-reviewed paper maybe could be revised.
But aren't you the author of that peer-reviewed paper?
I'm one of the authors, yes.
Okay. So I want to spend just a little bit more time on this concept of comparing the greenhouse gas reporting inventory. Isn't it true that this inventory is subject annually to a peer review, a public review, and a review by an international team of experts?
Yes, and I often review it.
Turning now to some of your comments specific to NMOGA's analysis. In your rebuttal testimony, you question NMOGA's critique of ERG's model plants. And in refuting this analysis, you refer to various studies that rely on geospatial measurements of air pollution. And so my question is, do geospatial measurements of air pollution tell you anything about how many components a particular type of site might have?
No.
And do geospatial measurements indicate the source of emissions at a component or an equipment level?
They estimate typically the source of emissions at the site level.
So while these methods may give you some estimate of the overall concentration of pollutant in a given geographical area, they don't tell you whether that pollution is coming from a PFAS controller or some other piece of equipment that has nothing to do with oil and gas.
Correct. Most of the approaches cannot distinguish the equipment the emissions are coming from.
In many of these studies, and let's speak at least with respect to this study we've been focusing on with respect to the 5 to 9 times greater methane emissions. Is it accurate to say that most of these measurements were conducted during the daytime?
Yes.
And isn't it true that oil and gas operators generally perform maintenance during the daytime?
That's my understanding. Yes.
And wouldn't that have the effect of biasing the results high by conducting the measurements at a time that maintenance is most likely to be occurring?
Potentially, yes. If maintenance was a large source of the emissions, then it could bias it high in our annual estimates if we're assuming that those daytime hours are representative of the annual average.
Let's see. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on your discussion of AVOs. And I want to just correct the record a little bit because your testimony seemed to imply that NMOGA or some other party is advocating that AVOs take the place of Method 21 and OGI measurements. Are you aware that no party is proposing that?
I'm not aware.
Have you ever conducted an AVO at an active oil and gas well site?
Not an official AVO. I've been at oil and gas sites and have heard and seen emission sources, but not as an official AVO inspection.
And in your testimony with respect to AVOs, I believe I heard you said that AVOs are good for detecting large emitters. Is that correct?
Yes, if they're more likely to detect large emitters.
And isn't that the primary concern with respect to LDAR, is in identifying the large emitters?
Yes, but I also said that I don't think AVO can reliably detect those large emitters.
And so a proposal where we have a mix of, say, weekly AVOs with other rigorous Method 21 OGI measurements, that represents an appropriate mix, correct?
I don't know if Method 21 and AVO together, I don't think that's an appropriate mix, but I do think you could have an appropriate mix of AVO and other instrument-based inspections, including things like OGI cameras and aerial surveys that can frequently detect large emitters.
Okay. I think that's all my questions, Mr. Lyon. Thank you. You've been very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis and Dr. Lyon. We do need a break. When we return from the break, I did see Mr. DeSalen on screen, and now I see Ms. Fox. When we return from the break, we'll continue with Dr. Lyon. Let's see, come back at 3:05, please.